Watch him disappear in a moment, folks.
Ed McCaffrey down the field.
Here it comes right now. Goodbye.
What a block by McCaffrey.
Nowadays, the most well-known McCaffrey is do-it-all running back Christian.
Tons of room to run, makes a move, and gets in the end zone.
McCaffrey use check blocking out front. Oh, a hurdle for McCaffrey, leaping his way for the touchdown.
With his little brother Luke beginning his NFL career.
And a BB over the middle. It's caught for a first down by McCaffrey.
And with a couple more brothers who played football at a high level, the genes had to come from somewhere, as their dad Ed was a standout for years with the Denver Broncos, as your prototypical possession receiver, playing a big role in their back-to-back Super Bowls in the late 90s. He checked all the boxes, standing 6'5" at a solid 215 pounds, with good route running and sure hands, so you could count on him to hold on to the ball, even if he was getting lit up across the middle. And although it's not easy to find receiver blocking highlights, Mike Shanahan wasn't lying.
Mike Shanahan has said Ed McCaffrey is the best blocking wide receiver I've ever seen in the National Football League.
The first great McCaffrey to put on a Stanford uniform, Ed spent the late 80s consistently improving for a mediocre Stanford Cardinal team, before heading to the NFL as a member of the New York Giants in the early 90s. His first few years with New York and San Francisco were solid, but nothing noteworthy. Yet once he got to Denver in '95, Easy Ed became one of the league's most reliable receivers, and one of John Elway's favorite targets. And he continued to peak even after Elway's retirement. And even though a late career injury stole a whole season from him, he still had a successful 13-year career. And while it wasn't Hall of Fame level, it just shows that when you talk about the McCaffreys, you can't forget about Ed. Let's jog your memory. A Pennsylvania native, Ed McCaffrey attended Central Catholic High School, where he would become one of the best high school players in the nation, and there were few positions that he didn't excel in. And even though he was a quarterback during his senior year, his main appeal came in playing tight end due to his size, but his 4.5 speed made him a candidate to play wide receiver as well. McCaffrey was the driving force of the Vikings as a senior, but a separated shoulder would sour his season, as it would cause him to miss 3 games. But that was 3 games too many for him, so he came back and played through it for 3 more games, so he could maintain his recruiting interest. But when doctors told him that he was just going to make it worse, he would sit out again, and overall play in just 5 of 11 games his senior year, with the Vikings recording just 2 wins. But even with such a disappointing season, McCaffrey would still be named a parade All-American, and was still one of the nation's most coveted recruits. And he had some football powerhouses hoping to land him. Yet when he took his visit to Stanford, he knew immediately that it was the place for him. Not necessarily because of football, but because of the community. And he was a fan of their head coach at the time, Jack Elway, whose son John was a Stanford alum and was currently starring for the Denver Broncos. When McCaffrey arrived for the '86 season, he was joining a Cardinal team who hadn't had a winning season since 1980. And while 1986 would be one of their best campaigns in years, led by junior running back Brad Muster, a freshman McCaffrey would play, but didn't play much of a role, as he would record 2 catches all season, for a Stanford team who would go 8-3 in the regular season, then lose to Clemson in the Gator Bowl, as McCaffrey's freshman year had ended with him catching 2 balls for 12 yards. McCaffrey had a much larger role as a sophomore. The team was quarterbacked by Brian Johnson, and while Muster was still the lead back, there was more of a committee approach. But in the passing game, McCaffrey became very involved, finishing second to Jeff James in receptions, while leading the team in receiving yards. But Stanford was an unpredictable team this year, as they would steamroll lesser opponents, but struggle against the more talented teams, as they would eventually finish at 5-8 and miss out on a bowl game, as McCaffrey's sophomore season had ended with him catching 30 passes for 533 yards and 2 touchdowns. Stanford would turn in an even worse 3-6-2 record in 1988, but they did this without McCaffrey, as he had taken a medical redshirt due to a quad injury, as 1988 would also be the final season of Jack Elway coaching the Cardinals, as come 1989, Stanford brought in one of their former position coaches to lead the team, in Dennis Green, and McCaffrey became a star. Green came from the San Francisco 49ers, who had become famous for their West Coast offense, so shades of that would be present in Stanford's offense. And when you have a guy as big as McCaffrey with sure hands, it's easy for him to become a security blanket, as he would be the top target for quarterbacks Brian Johnson and Steve Smith, as McCaffrey would return from injury to lead the team in receptions and receiving yards, while finishing second in receiving touchdowns, with his receptions and receiving yards both being top 5 marks in the Pac-10. But these great numbers were in part due to the team often playing from behind, as they were averaging about 4 less points than last year on offense, while allowing 4 more points on defense. And after a 1-2 start, they would drop 5 in a row. And although they'd go 2-1 in their final 3, a 4-8 record wasn't going to get them any bowl bids, as McCaffrey's junior season had seen him haul in 53 balls for 871 yards and 4 touchdowns. Overall, the 1990 season wasn't great for Stanford. However, it did bring some great moments. The team was quarterbacked by Jason Columbus and had a great backfield with dual threat transfer Glenn Milburn and touchdown Tommy Vardell. In the passing game, McCaffrey would once again be the team's top target among receivers, as he would put up career highs across the board. Yet although he would lead the team in receiving yards and receiving touchdowns by a large margin, he would be second to Milburn in receptions, yet would still be top 3 in the Pac-10 in all major receiving categories, as not only would he be named first team All-Conference, but he would also be a first team All-American. The season again started rocky with 2 straight losses out of the gate. Then Stanford got back on track with a shutout win over Oregon State, before losing the next week to San Jose State. But the following week saw an unranked Stanford team go into South Bend and defeat the top-ranked Irish, as McCaffrey would be very involved in the passing game, even recording a second quarter touchdown. But Stanford had another 3 ranked opponents on the schedule in their following 3 games, and would lose all 3 of them by double digits. But wins over Washington State and Arizona had them going into the season finale looking good, as the 1990 big game versus Cal would be one of the best in Stanford history. And although McCaffrey had been quiet, he came up big in the final seconds.
He goes, steps up, throwing for McCaffrey, he's open, he's got it, touchdown Stanford! There's the one big play!
With a touchdown that brought Stanford to within 1. Then after Stanford failed to convert the 2-point attempt, Cal fans rushed the field. But the game wasn't over, so a penalty was assessed that let Stanford kick off from midfield, and they would recover the onside kick and then go on to kick the game-winning field goal, as McCaffrey ended his college career on a high note, with his senior season ending with him catching 61 balls for 917 yards and 8 touchdowns, while adding 1 carry for 2 yards and another touchdown. But with his college career over, the All-American put his name into the '91 NFL Draft. The New York Giants used a 3rd-round pick on the big-bodied receiver, as while there was no guarantee of how good of a pass catcher he'd be in the NFL, he was a safe pick because of how good of a blocker he had shown himself to be at Stanford, as McCaffrey was not afraid of the physicality of the game. The 1991 Giants were the defending Super Bowl champs, so they had their roster pretty much in place, and although McCaffrey made the team, his rookie season wouldn't see him too involved in an offense who featured one of the league's best backfields, led by Rodney Hampton and Lewis Tillman. McCaffrey was deep on the receiver depth chart, with other guys like Mark Ingram and Stephen Baker demanding most of the targets from quarterback Jeff Hostetler, who would go down near the end of the season and be replaced by Phil Simms. And on defense, the Giants featured one of the best linebacker trios, with inside linebacker Pepper Johnson, outside linebacker Carl Banks, and all-time great Lawrence Taylor. So with an established team, McCaffrey saw limited opportunity, with his best game coming in Week 13, when he had 4 catches for 35 yards versus Tampa Bay. However, the defending champs struggled after Hostetler went down, losing 3 of their final 4 to finish at 8-8, which wouldn't even be enough for a return to the playoffs, as McCaffrey's season had wrapped with him catching 16 balls for 146 yards. The team looked the same in '92, except this year, Simms began as a starter, but an elbow injury would end his season after 4 games, leading to Hostetler taking over. Hampton was still leading the backfield, as he would turn in the best season of his career, and fullback Gerard Bunch would be a nice surprise as well. But then there was McCaffrey, who would again appear in all 16 games, and although he started just 3 of them, he would be the most targeted player on the team, and all those targets would help him break out, as he would lead the team in all 3 major receiving categories. But his numbers were low for a number 1 receiver, as New York had one of the worst passing attacks in the league. but McCaffrey would still record at least 4 receptions in 7 games. And as a starter in week 12 and 13, he would rack up nearly 180 receiving yards and a touchdown. But a few weeks before that, LT had gone down with a ruptured Achilles, which would end his year. The Giants were in the midst of a 3-game win streak that got them to 5-4 at the time of the injury. But after Taylor went down, they would win just 1 of their final 7 to finish the season at 6-10, and again miss the playoffs. As year 2 ended, with McCaffrey reeling in 49 passes for 610 yards and 5 touchdowns. But going into 1993, the Giants would bring in Dan Reeves as head coach, and New York would again look like a contender. Under Reeves, the Giants had a smash-mouth offense, as they would boast the league's top rushing attack this year, with Hampton and Tillman spearheading it. Hostetler was gone, so a 38-year-old Sims would run the offense. And while he played great, the passing attack just wasn't priority for the Giants, and McCaffrey saw a big drop in his numbers, with new acquisition Mark Jackson becoming Sims' favorite target, as this season would see McCaffrey record just 1 game with more than 3 receptions, and fail to break 50 yards in any game. But he maintained value as a great blocker in New York's dominant run game. Then on the other side of the ball, while the Giants had lost some of their top players during the offseason, one guy they had back was LT. And while he wasn't the same dominant force at 34 years old and coming off an Achilles injury, just his presence helped the defense, as overall New York allowed less than 13 points per game, which was the lowest in the league, and they would ride this to an 11-5 record, as they would go 6-2 in their final 8, which included a 6-game win streak, as they would get a wildcard matchup with Minnesota. And New York would lean on their ground game to grind out a win, as McCaffrey didn't see a single target. But they were still moving on to the divisional to take on San Francisco. On the stat sheet, McCaffrey looks like he had a much better performance, with 5 catches and 59 yards. But the Giants had no choice but to pass, as Ricky Watters scored 5 touchdowns on them, and overall San Francisco put up 44 points in a rout to end New York's year, with McCaffrey's season ending with him catching 27 balls for 335 yards and 2 touchdowns. But that would mark the end of McCaffrey's time with the Giants. In mid-July, the Giants would cut McCaffrey, as there were some contract disagreements between the two parties. But Reeves wasn't bothered, as he reportedly was never a big fan of the big receiver. But just days later, McCaffrey would sign with the team that eliminated him from the playoffs, returning to the state where he played his college ball. Yet once again, he was joining an established team who were coming off a conference championship appearance, with an already stacked offense, featuring Steve Young at quarterback and Ricky Watters at running back. And while McCaffrey had opportunity to earn targets in New York, that just wasn't going to happen in San Fran, with the Niners featuring longtime receiver John Taylor and an all-time great in Jerry Rice. So McCaffrey was buried on the receiver depth chart, only recording receptions in 5 games, with his best game coming in the season finale versus Minnesota, when he had 5 catches for 59 yards and a touchdown. And while this had ended in a loss, that was fine, as the Niners had won their previous 10, and overall went 13-3 this season, as they began the playoffs with a divisional round matchup against Chicago. McCaffrey wouldn't record a catch in this game, but it was easy work for the Niners, as they won by nearly 30 points. The conference championship versus Dallas was their toughest test, but after being beat by the Cowboys last year, they got their revenge this year. Yet McCaffrey again didn't record a catch, but he didn't care, because he was heading to the Super Bowl to take on the San Diego Chargers. And this game would finally see McCaffrey record a catch in the second quarter, filling in for Rice after he left the game briefly, but Rice returned eventually, and along with Young and Watters, dominated the Chargers defense to the tune of 49 points, as San Francisco captured their 5th championship and McCaffrey earned his first ring, as his 94 season had seen him haul in 11 passes for 131 yards and 2 touchdowns. But McCaffrey wouldn't be back in a 49ers uniform. However, he would eventually be back to the Super Bowl with his new team. The Denver Broncos were seeing their championship window with QB John Elway closing, so they made a change and brought in 49ers offensive coordinator Mike Shanahan. And Shanahan would bring in one of his own, as he would sign a free agent McCaffrey, with McCaffrey saying that being able to practice in front of Shanahan the past year showed the new Broncos coach all he needed to see, as at the very least, McCaffrey would be an effective blocker in the run game. But McCaffrey was one of many new signings, for a Broncos team going for a full remodel, but they were still led by another Stanford alum in Elway, while featuring rookie Terrell Davis in the backfield, who quickly proved his worth. But McCaffrey again had to earn his targets in the passing game, as he was behind number 1 wideout Anthony Miller and tight end Shannon Sharpe. But McCaffrey would put together his most productive campaign since his second year in New York, as he would finish 3rd on the team in receiving yards. And McCaffrey would record receptions in all but 2 games this year, including starting the season by recording over 50 yards receiving in 2 of his first 3, and he would end the regular season with his best performance, as he went for 99 yards and a touchdown on 9 receptions in a win over Oakland, marking their 8th win of the season. However, Denver's 500 record wouldn't be enough for a playoff berth, as McCaffrey's first year in Denver ended with him catching 39 balls for 477 yards and 2 touchdowns. Things continued to look up for McCaffrey during the '96 season, as he would score a touchdown versus New England in the season opener. Then in weeks 5 through 8, he racked up over 210 receiving yards and 4 touchdowns, which included him coming out of the bye week and catching 3 touchdowns in a win over Baltimore. And after missing the first game of his career in week 11, he would see his production dip slightly over the remainder of the season, as he would have just 1 more game with more than 43 yards receiving, yet he would still finish 3rd on the team in receptions and receiving yards, and really show his ability to find the end zone, with a then career-high 7 receiving touchdowns, to finish 2nd on the team. And year 2 with Shanahan had seen the Broncos improve on both sides of the ball, as a top 10 offense and defense, who would string together a 9-game win streak and lose just 2 of their final 12, to finish with the AFC's best record at 13-3. With many expecting them to run through their divisional matchup with Jacksonville. But that didn't happen, as the upstart Jaguars came in and shocked the Broncos. McCaffrey had a good day with 5 catches for 59 yards, but Denver went into the 4th quarter down by 11. Then although they fought back, their comeback attempt would fall just short, as McCaffrey's late game touchdown to bring Denver to within 3 would be as close as they would get, as their year ended in upset, with McCaffrey's season seeing him haul in 48 receptions for 553 yards and 7 touchdowns. But the Broncos had a new look to begin the '97 season, and an urgency to win one for John. The receiving trio was slightly different this season, as Miller was gone, but the 3rd-year Rod Smith broke out as the team's top receiver, with Sharpe turning in a career year as well. So although McCaffrey didn't see much of a difference in his numbers, those other 2 guys were demanding a lot of the targets. But McCaffrey was still a big red zone threat, as his 8 receiving touchdowns were a top 10 mark in the league. And when he wasn't scoring, he was still a reliable target on 3rd down, as one of the league's top possession receivers. And even if it wasn't a passing play, you could bet that Eddie Mack would be out there to block for Terrell Davis, who had firmly become one of the league's best running backs. McCaffrey would start the season strong, with one of his best games coming in a Week 2 defeat of Seattle, when he hauled in 8 passes for 93 yards and 2 touchdowns in a win, which was the second of 6 straight Bronco wins to start the year. Then as the season went on, McCaffrey would lose targets to Sharpe, yet would still manage a season-high 111 yards with 2 touchdowns in a Week 14 win over the Chargers. And overall, the Broncos were the highest scoring team in the league, with one of its best defenses. Yet even at 12-4, they wouldn't even win their own division, so they would find themselves in the wild card, trying to get revenge on Jacksonville for last year. And it was clear this game was personal, and Denver would just run the ball until Jacksonville stopped them. But they never did, as the Broncos had 2 players rush for at least 100 yards and 2 touchdowns, with McCaffrey not needing to do much in the passing game, as he had 2 catches for 33 yards in a rout. And now it was time to see who the best in the West was, as Denver was set to take on division champion Kansas City. Catches wouldn't come easy for anyone in this cold game, as Denver again relied on the ground game. And although McCaffrey had just 3 catches, his 43-yard catch and run in the 4th quarter would set up a Davis touchdown, which ended up being the difference maker, as the Broncos were moving on to the conference championship to take on Pittsburgh. Davis would have yet another dominant performance on the ground, while McCaffrey would have a solid 5 catches for 37 yards, as well as the go-ahead touchdown at the end of the first half, which ended up being the difference maker, as the Broncos were heading to the Super Bowl. Waiting for Denver was Brett Favre and the defending champion Green Bay Packers, as this would be a back-and-forth game, with both offenses putting up over 300 yards. and McCaffrey accounting for 45 of those on 2 catches. And his most remembered moment would come on a pass play.
Elway fakes to Griffith. The fullback, and Griffith down the sideline. Do you see the block of Ed McCaffrey?
As after Howard Griffith hauled in a pass late in the 4th quarter, a huge block from McCaffrey would help spring him for a 23-yard gain, eventually leading to Davis punching it in a couple plays later, which also ended up being the game winner, as the Broncos won their first Super Bowl and Elway finally got a ring, with McCaffrey's year ending with him catching 45 balls for 590 yards and 8 touchdowns. But the 1998 season would see the Stanford connection at its finest, thanks to a breakout year from McCaffrey. Up until this season, McCaffrey had been known as more of a role player, a guy you could rely on when your first 2 reads weren't open, and someone who wasn't afraid to do the dirty work in the running game. But his clutch play in the postseason was helping him shed that label, and this season would see him receive his biggest role yet. Denver had a high-powered offense once again, and Davis somehow continued to improve, as he would join the prestigious 2,000-yard club in '98. And while McCaffrey would see passes from both Elway and Bubby Brister, as Elway missed a few games with injury, he would still see the most targets of his career up to that point, which led to his best numbers yet, as his 64 receptions would tie for second on the team, with his 1,053 yards also being second, marking his first 1,000-yard season, and his career-high 10 touchdowns would not only tie for the team lead, it would also be a top 10 mark in the league. And McCaffrey was on all season, going for 47 yards in the season opener, then 117 yards the next week. And even though he had just 44 yards in Week 3 versus Oakland, he scored 2 touchdowns. Then he would find the end zone in 5 of his next 6, which included back-to-back 133-yard outings in Weeks 9 and 10. And the Broncos were unstoppable, as their top 2 offense and top 10 defense led to them starting the season at 12-0, and eventually finishing at 14-2. With McCaffrey's year earning him not only a spot in the Pro Bowl, but also a second-team All-Pro selection. And the top-seeded Broncos entered the playoffs with a divisional round matchup with Miami. McCaffrey would have 52 yards through the air and use his blocking to help Davis finish 1 yard short of 200 for the game, as Denver made easy work of the Dolphins to move on to an AFC Championship matchup with New York. But McCaffrey would haul in just 3 of his 9 targets for 66 yards. And the Broncos had been held scoreless and were down 10 in the 3rd quarter, but they would score 23 unanswered in the second half, as they were making a return to the Super Bowl and were set to take on the Falcons. McCaffrey would be his usual reliable self for the game, with 5 catches for 72 yards. And although the Falcons got on the board first, the Broncos would get the lead back and never relinquish it, winning by 15 to repeat as champions, as McCaffrey's best season up to that point had ended with his 3rd ring, and his season stats looked like 64 catches for 1,053 yards and 10 touchdowns. But after a storybook ending to his 16th season, it would also end up being the ending of Elway's career.
We all graduate from high school, we graduate from college. I'm just graduating from pro football.
So there was no more Stanford connection in Denver, but McCaffrey would be there for a while, as he had signed a 5-year extension during the offseason. But the Broncos' quest for a three-peat would be primarily in the hands of second-year QB Brian Griese. And to make things worse, Denver lost one of their best pass catchers after 5 games, when Sharpe's season was cut short due to a broken collarbone. And 1 game before that, Davis had blown out his knee and was also lost for the year. And although rookie Olandis Gary would have a career year, the Broncos' offense was still depleted. Luckily, Griese still had one of the best receiver duos in the league to rely on, as McCaffrey and Smith would combine for over 2,000 yards, with McCaffrey hauling in a then career-high 71 passes and leading the team in touchdown receptions. But these just weren't the same Broncos, as they had a scoring offense in the bottom half of the league. But McCaffrey went off in Week 1 with 6 catches for 105 yards and 3 touchdowns versus Miami. Yet after winning their first 12 games last year, Denver wouldn't win their first game this year until Week 5. But after McCaffrey sat out a Week 9 win over San Diego, he came back as one of Denver's most consistent players the rest of the way, as he would have at least 54 yards receiving in 6 of his final 7, yet only found the end zone once. And after their terrible start, Denver couldn't recover, finishing the year at 6-10. as they missed the playoffs altogether, with McCaffrey's year ending with him catching 71 passes for 1,018 yards and 7 touchdowns. Denver elected not to re-sign Sharpe after the season, opening the door for McCaffrey, as he would hit his peak in 2000. The Broncos had mostly avoided the injury bug during their Super Bowl runs, but now it was coming back to bite them in a big way, as in the first game of the season, Gary would tear his ACL, and Davis would deal with a stress reaction in his leg, which limited him to 5 games. So it was next man up in Denver, and this year it would be another rookie, as Mike Anderson rushed for nearly 1,500 yards. And while the O-line deserves the most credit for that, having a great blocker like McCaffrey only helped. But he wasn't blocking as much as he once did, because he was too busy catching passes. He began the year with 7 catches for 115 yards in a loss to the Rams. But then from weeks 5 through 12, he was a magnet, hauling in at least 5 passes in each game, including 3 games with 10 receptions in that stretch, as he capped it off with a career-high 148 yards on 10 catches with 2 touchdowns in a win over San Diego, as this marked the 3rd of 6 straight wins. And while McCaffrey cooled off over their next couple games, he had back-to-back 8 reception outings near the end of the year, and he and Smith would make history in a season finale win over San Francisco, as they would each surpass the 100 reception mark, making them the second duo in history to accomplish the feat, as McCaffrey put up career highs in receptions and yards, and finished with the 3rd most receptions in the league, while combining with Smith for over 2,900 yards and 17 touchdowns through the air. And while the Broncos had a weak defense, their high-powered offense had them averaging over 30 points a game, as they would finish at 11-5 and return to the playoffs. But they ran into one of the greatest defenses of all time in the wild card, and although McCaffrey hauled in a game-high 8 receptions for 75 yards, the Ravens held the Broncos to 177 total yards, as they won easily, with McCaffrey's career year ending with him catching 101 passes for 1,317 yards and 9 touchdowns. McCaffrey showed no signs of slowing down in the season opener versus New York, as about halfway through the 3rd quarter, he was already up to 6 catches for 94 yards and a touchdown. But his 6th catch had come on a 2nd and 9, when McCaffrey would snag a greasy pass with one hand, but the hit he took from Giants safety Sean Williams couldn't have ended up worse.
But great concentration, what a pro, one-handed catch in no man's land, and then a knockout shot by Sean Williams.
In a perfect representation of McCaffrey, he still held on to the ball, but he immediately knew something was wrong, and after being carted off the field, it was later announced that he had broken his left tibia and fibula, ending his season, and putting serious question marks around his career, as the Broncos would finish the year at 8-8 and miss the playoffs. And McCaffrey's one game would see him catch 6 balls for 94 yards and a touchdown. The good thing about his injury coming so early in the season is that it gave McCaffrey ample time to recover. And by opening day of the 2002 season, he was starting for the Broncos opposite Smith. And this year would see the Broncos roll out another rookie 1,000-yard rusher, as Clinton Portis went for over 1,500 on the ground. And it looked a bit like the Super Bowl days, as Sharpe had returned to Denver. But McCaffrey's comeback season was the most impressive, as he would play and start in every game and would score a touchdown in the season opener versus St. Louis. Then a Week 5 win over San Diego would see him go for 113 yards and a touchdown. As the Broncos started the year 4-1, McCaffrey would have 3 more 100-yard games this season, as he would still act as the team's second leading receiver behind Smith. But Denver couldn't keep their strong start going and finished the year at 9-7, which unfortunately was not enough for the playoffs, as McCaffrey's comeback year ended with him catching 69 balls for 903 yards and a touchdown, while adding 22 yards on the ground. McCaffrey's 2003 season wouldn't go as smoothly as 2002, as prior to the year, he would undergo hernia surgery. Then after 6 weeks with low production, he would miss 4 games with a quad injury, before returning for the team's final 6 games. Yet for the first time since his rookie season, he would fail to find the end zone. However, the Broncos finished at 10-6 and got a wildcard matchup with Indy. Unfortunately, McCaffrey had taken a hard hit to the head in the season finale, as he would miss the playoff game, with the Broncos falling to the Colts, as McCaffrey's year saw him record 19 catches for 195 yards. In February of 2004, McCaffrey would announce his retirement, as the injuries had been piling up over his last few years, with teammate Rod Smith expressing genuine concern for his health, as McCaffrey left the game with over 500 catches and nearly 7,500 receiving yards, as well as 55 touchdowns, and will always be a fan favorite in Denver. McCaffrey's life after football would see him combine philanthropy and sports, as he would run sports camps and even start his own foundation. And in more recent years, he ventured into a bit of coaching with limited success. And the McCaffrey name is again alive and strong in the NFL due to his kids. Ed McCaffrey wasn't flashy or loud, and his play wasn't the prettiest, but pretty doesn't matter if it's effective, and McCaffrey was the definition of effective. He had sure hands and could take a hit like few others. He was who you looked for on third down or in the red zone, and he didn't mind handing out hits of his own. As one of the greatest blockers of all time at the receiver position, he went from one of Stanford's greatest products to keeping himself on an NFL roster with hard work. And that's what got him his chance in Denver, as the hard work paid off. And for a brief period, he was one of the NFL's best receivers. But a horrible leg injury cut his prime short. And while he had a successful comeback season, his body quickly deteriorated after that, and he walked away before taking more big hits to the head. And while C-Mac will be the first to come to mind when talking about McCaffrey's and the NFL, Eddie Mac was the originator. But that's it for today's episode on Ed McCaffrey. Hope you enjoyed it, and make sure to subscribe for more videos like this one. If you liked it, check out this one on a player he won a Super Bowl with in San Francisco, or this one on a player he beat in that same Super Bowl. Thanks for watching, and see you next time.